At high noon in Redstone, a noose swung overhead with an Apache woman dangling from it. Bruises dark around her throat. The mob screamed for her death. A lone rancher rolled into town for salt and nails. He saw her eyes blazing. Not broken. He had one choice: walk away or cut the rope. He drew his knife. One stroke. The rope snapped, and the whole town knew he'd just started a war. If this story stirred something in you, drop a comment and tell me which moment hit the hardest. I read everyone at high noon. The town of Redstone was drowning in heat. Red dust hung in the air, thick as smoke, and the crowd roared like something wild and hungry. The townsfolk had packed themselves tight around the old barnyard. Every eye locked on the noose swinging overhead. Dangling from it was a woman, an Apache woman, tall and broad-shouldered, like she'd been carved from stone. Her bare feet kicked weakly in the air. Bruises wrapped dark around her throat, but her eyes, they weren't begging. They weren't broken. They blazed. The mob screamed for her death. Hang her. Let the monster die. A sneering deputy gripped the rope like he was putting on a show. That's when a weathered wagon rolled to a stop at the edge of the square. The man holding the reins was a rancher, Alone, his coat dusty and worn, his gray eyes carrying the weight of too many hard years. He'd only come to town for salt, nails, and a sack of coffee. Nothing more. But what he saw in that moment made his hands tighten on the reins until his knuckles went white. He knew the choice staring him down. Walk away. And he'd spend another night alone by the fire, sipping bitter coffee while a strong soul choked to death behind him. Step in, and the whole town would brand him a traitor. The moment stretched. Just one breath, one heartbeat. The giant Apache woman tilted her head and locked eyes with him. She didn't beg. She dared him. The rancher drew his knife. One clean stroke. The rope snapped. The crowd froze. Stunned into silence, the woman hit the ground hard. Gasping for air, the rancher stood there, still as stone, knowing full well there was no turning back now. A rough cough burst from her lungs as she collapsed to her knees. The rope burns bit deep into her neck, and her breath came out in hisses like steam off hot coals. Chaos erupted across the square. Some reached for their guns. Others screamed. Hold her down. Don't let that lunatic steal her. Deputy Morrison shoved his way through the crowd, a shining Colt in his hand. He shouted, "Coulter, do you even know what you just did? That savage was meant to die. And you just kicked dirt in the face of the law." The rancher stepped forward, his eyes cold as iron. He pulled his Winchester free and fired a single shot into the sky. The crack of it thundered through the plaza. Horses reared. The crowd scattered, cursing, but they backed off. Morrison glared, but he didn't dare fire in a square full of witnesses. "Fina," he spat, "take her. But know this tonight, I'm coming. Me and the whole damn town." The rancher didn't answer. He turned, lifted the towering woman into the wagon. She staggered, her bare feet leaving thin trails of blood in the dust. Jeers still rang out. Rocks clattered off the wheels. The wagon rolled away from the square. Behind them, Morrison gripped his pistol tighter, eyes blazing. The whole town of Redstone watched, knowing full well that Lone Rancher had just lit the fuse to a bloody war. On the road back, cold wind cut through the air. From time to time, the rancher glanced at the woman beside him. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. Her eyes stayed forward, sharp and steady, as if the noose had only made her stronger. The lone cabin came into view at the bottom of a long hill, small, weathered, but stubborn against the vast prairie. The rancher stopped the wagon and helped her down. She brushed off his hand, limping on her own. Wounded, but proud. That night, inside the wooden walls, fire crackled in the hearth. Wind howled outside like wolves on the ridge. The rancher sat by the door, gun across his lap. The giant Apache woman sat silently near the flames, her eyes reflecting the firelight. Both knew one thing for certain: the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. Dawn settled over the ranch with a pale light, cold as sharpened steel. The rancher had been up for hours, his worn boots sinking into the dew-soaked earth as he inspected the fence line. The night wind had snapped a few posts, sagging the wire. Cattle could break loose at any moment. He drove his shovel into the dirt, ready to lift a new post, when the giant figure appeared behind him, the Apache woman, rope burn still bruising her neck, approached without a word. Quietly, she bent down and lifted the full-length log he'd been struggling with. Muscles rippled down her arms as she set it into the hole, as if it were nothing more than a branch. The rancher paused, surprised. He was used to the hollow eyes of the rescued, grateful, timid, broken, but not here. Here was strength, unspoken and unmoved. All morning they worked side by side without a word. He pulled the wire taut. She held the post. He swung the hammer. She handed him nails. When the sun rose high and sweat ran down his brow, he offered the canteen. She took a sip and passed it back, her eyes meeting his without flinching. Their language was labor, not speech. Inside the cabin, silence ruled as well. The rancher built a fire, boiled a thin soup from dry beans. He set a bowl in front of her. She ate slowly, her eyes fixed more on the flames than on him. That night, she didn't sleep in the narrow bed. She sat with her back to the wall, eyes open until morning. Like a sentinel, the rancher lay listening to the wind cut through the cabin walls, knowing full well she hadn't slept either. The next day, he found a gate hinge loose on the barn. Before he could fetch the hammer, she stepped forward, picked up the fallen pin, and drove it back into place with a few sharp blows. She didn't look at him, didn't expect thanks. The rancher stood still, and in that quiet moment, he understood. She wasn't here to be rescued. She was here to survive on her own terms. That evening, in the golden firelight, the rancher tapped the body of his Winchester, listening to the wind rush over the open plains. The woman sat near the hearth, her deep eyes glowing red in the reflection of the fire. Still silent, still distant, but no longer strangers. It was the silence of those who knew sometimes survival needs no words. Only someone who will stand beside you when the ground begins to shake. That afternoon, the western sky was a dull gray, heavy as a pan of ash. Wind churned in swirling gusts, sweeping dust and sand across the plains. The rancher hurried to bolt the windows, herd the animals into their stalls, and locked the cabin tight. The wind screamed through the cracks like cutting blades. Inside, by the flickering firelight, the silhouette of the Apache woman sat still as a statue. The flames swept across her sun-scorched face, the rope's bruises still etched on her neck, her unblinking gaze fixed on the darkness. The rancher sat nearby at the table, quietly cleaning his Winchester. And then, for the first time, her voice cut the silence. Raspy, like a pebble rolling at the bottom of a canyon. Why did you save me? The rancher looked up, pausing for a moment. He'd grown used to her silence after days of speechless labor, almost forgotten she had a voice at all. He answered quietly, his tone stiff as old wood, because no one else there did. She turned toward him, fire not of fragility, but of defiance burning in her eyes. Slowly, her words dropped like heavy stones. It was my own people who hung me. The rancher froze. Outside, the wind paused for a beat. As if to let her words settle, she explained. She had once been a warrior in her tribe, so strong that even mounted Apache scouts held back. But when she refused a marriage arranged with the chief's son, the tribe saw it as disgrace. One night, she was captured, bound, and it was her own kin who twisted the noose around her neck. The townspeople had merely carried out a sentence already passed. The rancher remained silent, his grip tight on the gunstock. He understood now. He hadn't only saved a life. He'd stepped into an age-old conflict between worlds, his own white township and the Apache people outside. Hooves echoed faintly, then vanished on the wind. The rancher stepped to the porch, eyes scanning the rising dust line. Fresh hoof prints marked the ground. Someone had been watching the ranch through the storm. He turned back inside, eyes meeting those steely ones belonging to the towering woman. No words were exchanged, but they both knew the hanging night was only the beginning. There would be others, more men, hungrier, angrier, coming back for her. Thank you for being here. If this story brings back memories of the old days, the red dusty afternoons, the sound of horses' hooves echoing in your heart, subscribe to my channel so that every day we can sit together and I can tell you another Western story. That night, the wind had fallen silent, but the air outside remained heavy, like a dark blanket pressed against the prairie. The rancher sat in his wooden chair, his Winchester resting across his lap. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers. The giant Apache woman sat motionless by the door, her posture straight, her large hands resting on her knees, still and silent as a statue. A guardian. Then came the thunder of hooves in the distance. Slow, heavy echoes. A torch flickered, then another, until a line of fiery red lights flickered closer, like a line of hunting beasts drawing near. The rancher stood, his fingers tightening on the rifle's grip. The woman moved, too, her eyes alight with fire. Outside, a voice roared, "Open the door. Coulter, bring out that monster, and you may yet live." The rancher recognized Deputy Morrison's voice, the same man who had sneered at him earlier in the town square. Now Morrison had returned with 8 armed men, torches blazing, surrounding the cabin like ravenous wolves. "You know she's not human, she's a monster. She'll kill you in your sleep." Morrison howled, voice cracking like dry wood through the slats of the door. The rancher answered in a low, gravelly tone, "Tonight, whoever crosses this fence will not live to see tomorrow." A crack of gunfire split the silence. Wood splintered from the cabin wall. The rancher yanked the giant Apache woman down to the floor, pressing her body low. But fear didn't flicker in her eyes. Instead, she growled softly and seized the heavy chopping axe. With a mighty shove, she burst through the side door like a whirlwind. One sweeping blow knocked a torch from a man's hand. The fire swiping across his face. Chaos erupted. The rancher rushed out beside her, firing 2 shots from his Winchester. 2 attackers went down in the dust. Morrison screamed and whipped his horse back. Yet he still bellowed, "Surround them. Burn this camp to the ground." A can of oil smashed against the cabin's wall, flaring into flame. The rancher lunged forward, beating the blaze with a blanket, sweat pouring from his forehead. The giant woman stood guard at his side, her axe swinging wide. Each blow forced the gunman back. In the firelight, she looked like a legend, come to life. The fighting raged through the night. Only at dawn, when the rooster's call broke the tension, did the attackers retreat, leaving behind smoke, horse bodies, and blood-stained earth. Morrison vanished into the breaking dawn, hurling a final taunt. "You won't hold her for long." Coulter, inside the cabin, surrounded by ashes and debris. The rancher collapsed to the floor, breath ragged. The Apache woman set her axe down. Her chest heaved, but her gaze remained as cold and steady as steel. No words were spoken, but both understood the real battle had only just begun. Dawn broke after a night of flames. The sun filtered through a haze of dust, illuminating the grassland, still marked with hoof prints and dried blood. The rancher stood on the porch of the cabin, fingers resting on the stock of his Winchester, eyes shadowed by sleepless exhaustion. Beside him, the giant Apache woman sat unmoving, her axe planted deep in the ground, like a spear guarding the threshold. Then from the horizon, dust swirled, and hooves sounded in the distance. First sparse, then gathering in fierce rhythm, 30 Apache riders appeared, their dark horses glistening in the rising sun. They formed a half circle, closing in on the small homestead. Leading them was an elder chieftain, his hair streaked with gray, his face carved with hardship. He raised a ceremonial staff high, his voice deep and resonant. "My warrior, you should have died. Why are you still alive?" The giant turned slowly to stand, her neck still bruised from the rope, her eyes burning bright. She didn't look at the rancher, nor did she bow to her own people. Her voice was hoarse, but clear with determination. "Because I did not bow, not to the noose, not to the men who thought they could own me." Murmurs rippled through the riders. Some rested hands on their spears. Others lowered their heads as if struck. The chieftain's voice was grave. "You defied your people, refused the marriage alliance, brought shame upon your father. Now you stand with the white man. Choose, return and face judgment, or die here." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the wind rustling through dried grass. The rancher tightened his grip on the rifle, ready to fire the first shot. Yet the giant placed a steady hand on his arm. She stepped forward, towering alone amid 30 horses. "I will not return. I choose to stay. Not for the land, not for this wooden cabin, but because here, for the first time, I am seen as a person." Her words echoed louder than the approaching hooves. The chieftain studied her in silence. Finally, he lowered his staff and turned his horse. "Then bear that choice. We will no longer protect you. Only be one." The 30 riders withdrew, leaving the grasslands eerily silent. The rancher exhaled hard, cold sweat dampening his shirt. The giant Apache woman turned to him, her gaze still fierce, but now softened by a flicker of warmth. The choice had been made. There was no going back. The afternoon after the 30 riders withdrew, the pasture before the cabin lay quiet, eerie in its stillness. Only the wind whispered through warped fence boards, and a lone hen clucked. Startled from the previous night's chaos, the rancher swept up scattered ashes in the yard. Shoulders aching and hands raw from splintered wood cutting into his skin. The giant Apache woman sat by the porch. The bruise on her neck had darkened further, but her gaze tracked the rancher's every move, not with the wary glint of early days, but with the steady warmth of shared purpose. When the rancher began repairing the fence, she walked over without being asked. Wordlessly, her massive hands lifted a full log and set it into the hole. He looked up and offered a faint, knowing smile. For the first time in years, the cabin wasn't a lonely fortress. It was a home held together by shared work. That night, inside the quiet cabin, the rancher pulled out a small, dust-covered wooden box. Inside lay a string of old beads, the tribal chief's heirloom, once passed down through her lineage. When she fled, the chief had left them on the porch. A silent severing of bonds. The rancher picked up the beads, dusted them gently, and placed them on the table. The giant Apache woman stared, her hands trembling slightly before slowly taking the beads. She didn't cry, but her breath caught. Moments later, she rested her calloused hand upon the rancher's. "If I stay," she said softly, "it is my choice, no one else's." The rancher nodded without words. He pulled an old cradle close to the hearth and placed the bead necklace upon it. In the fire's glow, the beads sparkled like tiny stars, symbols of a new beginning. That night they sat long by the fire, neither rescuer nor rescued. They were two souls bearing scars of the past, bound by a decision. From now on, their fates would be entwined. Outside, wind swept across the endless plains. Inside, the firelight pooled around them, merging their shadows on the wooden wall into the shape of one towering figure, steady, strong, and defiant enough to face the world. The harsh winter passed slowly, leaving shattered ice along the creek and smoky ash staining the cabin walls. But with March's return came sunlight that spilled across the prairie like warm honey. The ice melted, and patches of green grass pushed up from the wet earth, living proof that even death cannot hold the whole world forever. The rancher stepped out onto the porch, his boots sinking into the soggy mud, arms carrying a bundle of new fence posts. Behind him, the giant Apache woman followed, erect and resolute against the clear sky. She lifted each post effortlessly and set it into the ground like she was planting a tree into the earth itself. He secured the wire. She held the posts steady. Together they worked in rhythm, their actions interlocked like long familiar gears. Occasionally, townsfolk rode by, stopping in the distance to glance at the homestead. No one dared come near. After the siege on the cabin and the arrival of 30 Apache riders, the rancher's name had become synonymous with the man who aimed his gun at the world just to protect the woman labeled a monster. But in his eyes, she was no monster. She was a warrior, proof that survival can grow into a home, given someone willing to share the burden. One evening, the rancher sat by the newly built cradle, his fingers brushing the beads resting upon it. Beside him, she stood silent. Her gaze was distant, but no longer cold. Then she spoke softly. "Back then they bound me to kill me. Today I choose to bind myself with this string of beads." He turned toward her, the steel-gray sadness in his eyes calming. Gently, He replied, "That rope lifted you to death, but this string keeps you tethered to life." She lowered her head and placed her large hand over his. In that moment, every wound, every prejudice, every grudge seemed to dissolve as dusk fell. Red golden light spilled across the prairie. Wind stirred the dust, but this time it carried the scent of new grass and rebirth. The rancher gazed toward the horizon, whispering to himself, "The day I cut that rope was the day I cut the shackles from my own heart." And so, in the wild frontier, a lone rancher and a towering Apache warrior had found a bond stronger than death, a bond of choice, of trust, and of freedom. In the West, not every bullet defines fate. Sometimes a single rope cut at the right moment frees two people, one from death, the other from loneliness. And maybe what we hold most dearly to the end is the right to choose to stay together. My deepest wish is that all of you live in joy and fulfillment. That has always been my hope. Please accept that. I love you, my dear, honored audience. Let me know how this story touched you by dropping a comment below. Every detail in this story comes directly from the original narrative, preserving the emotional arc, the choices made, and the bond that was formed exactly as it unfolded. 5. Takeaway points. Point 1. Sometimes the right choice is the one that costs you everything. The rancher could have bought his salt and ridden home. Instead, he cut the rope in front of a mob, screaming for her death. Deputy Morrison promised revenge. The whole town branded him a traitor, but he didn't flinch. He knew there was no turning back. Point 2. Strength doesn't always come with gratitude or softness. The rancher expected hollow eyes, timid and broken. Instead, the Apache woman lifted the fence post he'd been struggling with like it was nothing. She didn't thank him. She didn't bow. She worked beside him in silence, on her own terms, proving she wasn't there to be rescued. Point 3. Real freedom is choosing who you stand with, not who chose you first. When 30 Apache riders circled the cabin and the chieftain demanded she return or die, she stepped forward alone. She told them she wouldn't go back. Not for land, not for the cabin, but because here, for the first time, she was seen as a person. Point 4. Survival isn't about waiting to be saved. It's about standing when the ground shakes. When Morrison and 8 armed men surrounded the cabin with torches, she didn't hide. She seized the axe, burst through the door, and fought like a legend. The rancher fired beside her. Together, they held the line until dawn broke and the attackers fled. Point 5. The bonds we choose are stronger than the ones we inherit. Her own people twisted the noose around her neck for refusing an arranged marriage. The rancher cut that rope and gave her a choice. By spring, she sat beside him, holding the tribal beads. N'oranger à chain but à symbole. She chose to bind herself, not to survive, but to live